here's our agenda for the next hour. We plan to cover different solvent types in auto repair. We'll go over human and environmental hazards of solvent use, toxic solvent-based parts washing and its alternatives, and we'll cover some aerosol alternatives as well. All right, so let's jump in. So there are 3 different types of solvents used in auto repair. Water is one, hydrocarbons is another. This is also petroleum-based solvents, and the last is halogenated. So halogenated elements include those that are circled there on the periodic table. So that's fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and iodine. And for parts washing, chlorine or chlorinated solvents is the most common halogenated element that you'll find in auto shops. So we do also see fluorine in certain detailing products like wheel shine products, but chlorine is the primary one that we'll focus on today. So, you know, over the years, we've had mechanics confused by the term chlorinated. You know, people say I have chlorine in my brake cleaner. So this is different. This is a different chemical structure than the pool sanitizer or chlorine bleach used in laundry. So a chlorinated solvent that you find at auto shops is a chemical compound that has 1 or 2 carbon atoms with at least 1 chlorine atom. And the chlorine structure that's in a chlorinated solvent gives it the ability to absorb organic materials and creates the solvent effect. So chlorinated solvents tend to lead to higher risks to health than hydrocarbon and obviously higher than water. So some short-term exposure issues that may come up include respiratory issues, skin and eye irritation, burns, sometimes nausea, and in rare cases that not normally in the auto repair industry, short-term exposure can lead to death. Long-term exposure can cause cancer, it can cause nervous system damage, blindness, organ damage, and even developmental harm. So, you know, chlorinated solvents are commonly used, and we really want to avoid them whenever possible. And I'm going to tell you a quick story about a mechanic from one of our EcoBiz auto businesses who had long-term exposure to chlorinated solvents. He's been around auto mechanic work since he was a kid, helping his dad at the shop. He eventually grew up to be a mechanic and has been working full-time for almost 20 years in the industry. Well, a few years ago, he started noticing neurological issues, started losing patches of hair. His doctor couldn't figure out what was happening, so he went to a specialist and then another specialist after that, and eventually they determined that his neurological issues, his hair loss, were due to long-term exposure to these toxic solvents. So ever since, he's been avoiding products with toxic chemicals and chlorinated solvents and finding safer solutions to continue working as a mechanic and trying to turn these health issues around. So we are exposed to different chemicals in different ways. Some chemicals are going to have higher impacts if you breathe them in versus, you know, getting them on your skin versus ingesting them, which hopefully is not happening. So note in the inhalation column here that aerosols are likely going to be the highest impact for inhalation because the fine mist can penetrate deeper into the lungs than vapors, you know, when you open up a container or you're transferring liquids. And of course, you know, we should always be using the proper PPE. And some solvents are known to permeate the skin, which can possibly contributing to higher exposure because you might also be breathing in the fumes while being dermally exposed. So toluene, which is a common solvent that you'll see in the auto industry, is one example where it can be both you expose it to your skin and inhale the vapors. Highly alkaline chemicals that may be used in aqueous cleaning can also soften skin cells and pass through this layer to the dermis and cause damage to skin and eyes without proper PPE use. So the dose makes the poison. In the 1500s, a Swiss physician, Paracelsus, noted that the dose is what makes something poisonous. So one extreme example of how this is true is the fact that, even consuming too much water at once can put you at risk. And there's a story from several years ago about a contestant in a water drinking competition who actually died of acute water intoxication. So the hazard here was low with the water, but the exposure was very high. So risk is dependent on how much of the chemical you are exposed to, how concentrated it is, how long you're in contact or how long you're breathing it in, how frequently you're exposed, and whether someone is more susceptible. And the most susceptible populations that are at risk are those who are chronically exposed, those who have compromised immune systems, and then our pets and our children and the elderly. And oil and vapors can go home with you from work on your clothes, on your shoes. You walk through a chemical spill, you walk through an oil spill, and come home tracking it onto the floor and into your laundry or the couch. And then kids or pets playing on the floor can come into contact with these chemicals or oil. And this graphic just shows how children are more vulnerable to toxics because they're smaller than adults. But children intake more chemicals per pound of body weight. And plus they're still developing organs, including their brain, which makes them more susceptible to exposure. So moving into volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, most chlorinated and hydrocarbon-based solvents are volatile, which means they are more prone to evaporation at room temperature, and therefore they're more likely to be inhaled as fumes or as vapors. And VOCs are also what contribute to smog. Acetone is one common ingredient in parts cleaning that has lower VOCs, lower volatility. So I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Michelle for this part.
Thank you, Brittany. This is a little bit of a complicated chart. I'll try to explain it really briefly. So the halogenated products we talked about earlier include the chlorine, bromine, and fluorine. And as Brittany mentioned, the chlorinated is the ones that we're quite concerned about because they're still prevalently used in the auto industry. So this chart talks about different hazard endpoints. And by that, I mean cancer is one hazard endpoint, endocrine disruption, organ toxicity. So I tried to, these are all these endpoints are kind of lumped into these different ways to assess the chemicals. But the top 6 or so are halogenated compounds, and then the others are non-halogenated that we might see in other solvents. So Prop 65, you probably all have heard of that. There's 900 chemicals on the list. It's cancer, reproductive, and developmental toxins. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. All the blue check marks are pulled from this tool called the green screen or list translator. It's used to assess overall ranking of hazards posed by different chemicals. So if in the green screen tool, these chemicals got a high ranking on any of these, then I gave it the blue check mark. But so we have high, second column, we have high cancer, developmental, reproductive, or endocrine disruption. The third column is mammalian toxicity, mostly looking at organ toxicity. The fourth column is high risk of eye and skin irritant or damage. And then here's our VOCs. So you can see almost all of the chlorinated and most of the non-halogenated and the halogen. Most of them do pose a significant amount of risks. Next slide, please. So how do these things, these exposure to humans, but they get into our environment as well. And so into the air, we have airborne particulate, which can deposit to the ground, eventually run off and seep into the ground. We have the VOCs that can become released to the atmosphere, contributing to smog. And some of these aerosols especially have propellants that are, and hydrocarbons that are contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So in the water, illicit dumping and spills or runoff can eventually reach waterways. And the POTWs are not able to always remove everything that comes to them in the sanitary sewer, especially if chemicals are coming in high concentrations or high amounts. And or I'll give you an example of a phosphorus situation in a little bit. But then there's also illicit dumping spills and deposition of the airborne particulate onto the land, which can infiltrate groundwater and contaminate the soil. And then inappropriate spill cleanup products can eventually lead, if it's done improperly, can reach the waterways as well or seep into the ground. Next slide, please. So here's a similar chart to what we saw for the human exposure. And here's some, but these are more of the environmental endpoints, such as aquatic toxicity, persistence in the environment, the VOCs. And the VOCs were on the other chart because they're human health hazard plus an environmental hazard. Hazardous air pollutants, which is a regulated regulation. And I hope you guys are mostly familiar with that. Flammability, and then the global warming potential. So interestingly, carbon tetrachloride has a 1,400 times global warming potential in comparison to carbon dioxide. So certainly that's something we'd want to avoid at all costs. Plus it's one of the typical halogenated ingredients. I really haven't seen a lot of that particular chemical in the aerosols that I've looked at, the auto repair aerosols. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you through some ways to identify some of these hazards and hopefully help people understand the importance of labels and warnings and safety data sheets. I'm not going to talk about technical data sheets, but they are kind of important for proper product use. Some of that information is also in the SDS. So next slide, please. Identifying chlorinated solvents. Pretty easy. You see chlor in the ingredient name. So, and notice I've listed several here, and the names are, many chemicals have different names, synonyms we call them, but for chlorinated, you're going to see chlor in the ingredient. For fluorinated, you'll see fluor, and for brominated, you would see BRON in the name. We already heard about chlorinated solvents as the bad actors, and the fact that that's not really like your pool sanitizer or bleach used in laundry, because it's combined with a carbon structure, which causes more of that toxicity, but also contributes to why it works so well and works fast and doesn't leave much residue. Next slide, please. So we have the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, GHS for short. Hopefully most are familiar with these, but it was adopted several years ago, and they changed it from a previous system to make it kind of internationally universal. So it's a good thing to know what each of these mean. You can buy the posters and put them on your shops and then look for them on product labels and in your SDSs. And the next slide shows a nice little tool, super quick to look up if you're questioning a particular ingredient. It's called chemhat.org. And I like this tool a lot because it explains probably better than an SDS is at the individual ingredient level, the issues with a particular chemical. And especially I like this because we have a color-coded, the red and the orange and the yellow, they're color-coded to help identify that level of the hazard versus, yes, it's a hazard, but how bad of a hazard is it? Next slide. California Prop 65. This is something you'd want to look for on a label or an SDS. It's a California law, but it has nationwide ramifications because any product can be sold in California. So pretty much the entire nation has to put this on their label. There are 900 ingredients on this list, and sometimes the SDS will say that it is a Prop 65, sometimes it does not. But this is an important thing to look for, especially in your auto parts cleaning products. Next slide. So now I'll try to quickly go over safety data sheets and how to kind of pull out critical or important information. I assume a lot of safety data sheets are probably just filed away. That's how we did it when I worked in industry. Filed away and nobody really took a close look at them, but they are, I think they have a lot of helpful information. So I'm trying to pull out some of the more important sections, the stars, and I'll quickly go through those. So next slide. Section 2 is, we talked about these hazard endpoints, and that's going to often list many different formats, many different ways, but it will list the hazards of the product as a whole. And so when category 1 under the GHS labeling system is the greatest level of hazard, category 2 is more hazardous than category 3, less than 1, etc. So it's reverse of the old NFPA scale. Signal words. We have caution, we have warning, and we have danger. These are often on a product. It's the label of the product itself as well. But caution is kind of on a slightly toxic realm. Warning, you're getting a little bit more toxic, and danger is the high and the severe, more severe toxicity. We also might see hazard statements. And the GHS pictograms, sometimes they're on an SDS and sometimes they're not. Next slide. Here's a different format for a section 2 for the hazard identification on an SDS. And they've listed a flammable aerosol, and then they have this H phrase, they call them afterwards. And how do you interpret that H phrase? I always have to look it up really quick. Just search H phrases on the web. And then it gives you this this list of what all these mean, and you can see it's kind of a gradation. So 300 is fatal if swallowed, 301 is toxic if swallowed, 302 is harmful if swallowed, et cetera, et cetera. So that's helpful to understand the rank, or I guess the level of the hazard. Okay, next slide. Section 3 is our composition. So here's our example 1. It's tetrachloroethylene with a carbon dioxide propellant. There's our chlor that we know now to identify chlorinated chemicals or chlorinated compounds. And this one's especially concerning because it's 90 to 100% of the aerosol product itself. So you need to look at both the ingredient and the concentration. And then we have toluene, which we talked, example 2, toluene, which talked about earlier. It's one of those that absorbs in the skin, plus you can breathe it. And this product has 30 to 50%. So probably something you're going to want to avoid. Next slide. This one's kind of a little bit complicated, but I like to pull out a couple of things out of here. The pH, we'll talk more about that when we get to the aqueous detergents, but it tells you the pH if it's relevant. Talks about flammability, and then percent volatile. So this is the VOCs that Brittany introduced to us. And this particular one is 81%, which is really, really high. I'll give some context for that in a little bit. Next slide. Section 8 is good. How do you control your exposure and what's your PPE? And oftentimes you'll see a lot of this gobbledygook complex data at the top, and that's why it's such a kind of a turnoff for people to try to understand an SDS. But if you go to the verbiage, typically you're going to get some really good advice. You can ignore that, all that data, unless you're a toxicologist by nature or a chemist, PhD chemist. Okay, next slide. Last section I'll talk about here is if your company is concerned with its impacts to the environment, you can, this is a good section. Again, and this one gives you a bunch of toxicity data, which might not be readily understandable, but look at again at the verbiage. This one's toxic to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. So that's something you want to avoid spilling, avoid releasing to air, etc. So next slide. That kind of wraps up some of the hopefully easier ways to identify some of these hazardous products. So solvents, part washers, what are some alternatives and what are the benefits of the alternatives? The solvent parts washers may include the sink on a drum type or an immersion tank. But there's alternatives. One is actually to convert to a soy-based or plant-based solvent in those types of parts washers. The soy-based, I've heard, leaves somewhat of a residue, so it requires a little bit of a extra effort at the end to clean that off. But it is safer than the chlorinated and most of the hydrocarbon-based solvents. Then we have the enzymatics, the ultrasonics, and different aqueous systems. And I'll show you a picture of a steam cleaning effort done by a shop we know of, but also it's all over YouTube that I'll show you in a little bit. Benefits of these alternatives: you're reducing your hazardous waste. You're reducing risk of transferring and solvent spills when transferring fluids around. Hopefully reducing flammability and reducing exposure to staph. Next slide. So safer bulk solvents. If you continue to use the safer or the bulk solvents, here's a couple of things to avoid. Chlorinated, methanol or benzene compounds, and xylene or toluene above, some companies may stipulate they want 0% because these are carcinogens. But sometimes the less toxic formulations need a little bit of a kick to help them get that cleaning efficacy. So clearly you want to use your PPE at all times. But you can choose non-chlorinated that are petroleum or hydro-based or hydrocarbon or soy-based. And then the low VOCs, that's a big important thing too, although the low VOCs may still contain some of these, xylene or toluene or some of the non-chlorinated items. So we have this SCAQMD. I'll show a picture of that in a minute, but that's a Southern Coast Air Quality Management District, sorry about that, in California, and they have a really low standard. So if you see an SCAQMD compliant product, it's got to have about 3% VOC by weight. Remember on that SDS, we had 81%. And the California or 50 state compliant, we're looking at, it has to be less than 10% to get that on their label. So like I said, it doesn't always guarantee low toxicity, but it's going to be lower and probably less hazardous than the chlorinated. Next slide. So one of our alternatives we wanted to talk about today is enzymatic parts washers. Oh, Brittany, this is you. Sorry.
This is me. So yeah, moving into enzymatic parts washers as an alternative to the solvents parts washers that Michelle was just talking about. So we know of several different models on the market. We can't necessarily recommend or endorse any one unit or the solutions that they come with over another, but enzymatics are great. They require temperature a little above ambient to keep enzymes happy. And we're seeing more and more shops, at least within the EcoBiz program, that are using enzymatic washers. So again, we have these QR codes. If you're interested in any one in particular, you can scan that with your phone. Here are a few other washers, and then an example, it's a little blurry, but of the mat or the pouch that is used in most of the units. So according to one of the brands, CRC, their mat not only picks up large particles and grease, but it also helps release the microbes into the solution. And if this, enzymatic type washers are of interest, you probably want to shop around for the best fit for your operation. Some of them may require servicing contracts, so just something to be aware of. And some unit manufacturers recommend this Aussie Juice and Aussie Juice Enzyme Booster. Other systems may recommend use of their own or other fluid and enzyme products. Whenever possible, we recommend looking for these third-party certified safer options for the cleaning products. So the Aussie Juice Booster and this SW4 solution have this EPA Safer Choice logo. And you'll see the label on the actual products. BioCircle here is Eco Logo certified. So there are different types of certifications, and that's another topic for a different day. But the important part is that they have undergone external third-party review, and they have this stamp of approval that is deeming them as safer. And one advantage of enzymatic parts washers is that traditional solvents parts washers, they quickly become saturated with grease and oil and debris, and then they become ineffective over time. Whereas enzymatics maintain continuous efficacy over time. You don't have to dump them. You just need to add the enzyme booster and a new base solution when it runs low. So next, here to share their experience with enzymatic parts washers, I'm going to pass it over to Maya Halverson, who is the program director at Green Drop Garage. Take it away.
Oh, thanks, Brittany. All right. So my name is Maya Halverson. I am the program director at Green Drop Garage. I have about 15 years experience in harm reduction in a variety of industries. Starting in construction, moving to higher education facilities, healthcare facilities, and now finding myself in automotive repair, which I'm a little in love with, which is why I'm here. So our experience with enzymatic parts washers starts not quite when the business opened. The business opened in 2009. Doing biodiesel conversions. But as it expanded into full car repair, 1 to 2 years later, that's when the enzymatic parts washer was implemented at our flagship location. And we've opened 3 locations since then where that's the only parts washer that anyone at that location has ever known. So any shop that we do open up, we choose specifically our choice is the CRC Smart Washer. We have really great experience with it. There's so many reasons to have one and to make that switch. But from a business operation standpoint, the maintenance on it is so much lower. So with the older parts washers, I think of them as older. I mean, it's just a different technology, but that's how I think of it. You had to have a service come usually about once a month. They had to take all the fluids. There's a tremendous amount of fumes you have to deal with. There is additional PPE requirements. And then there's also the risk of these toxics not being handled carefully and ending up in a waste stream. So that's all of those and more are the benefits of a parts washer from a business operations perspective. But when you're working with them actively, they're just more of a pleasure to work with. They're easier to maintain without specialist knowledge. Like Brittany was saying, the mats in ours have to be replaced about once a month, sometimes more frequently, sometimes less often, dependent on use. And then the enzymatic cleaner just continues to clean itself using these microbial enzymes, which to me, it's scientific magic. I get really excited about it. And so that's our experience. We're available too for questions. If people have questions about use of enzymatic parts washers, you can reach out to me. And with that, I will pass it back to Brittany and Michelle. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Maya. Yeah, and again, if anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll have a period at the end for Q&A as well. Okay, great. So building off of what Maya just said, here is an example from an auto vocational program in Massachusetts that shows the cost benefit and operating costs after switching from a traditional bulk solvent parts washing system to an enzymatic parts washer. So you can see that the investment paid off after about 11 months. And then going forward, it led to nearly $3,000 in annual savings. Also noting that before PPE was required and after it was, just minimal PPE and reduced exposure. And another example, unlike the previous one, to reduce bulk solvent use, a small garage in Minnesota was using both of these aerosol products that are listed here. So one has 100% VOC content, one has 35% VOC content, and they purchased a smart washer enzymatic unit, which is 0% VOC content, to replace both of the aerosol products. And they were able to reduce waste caused by these aerosol brake cleaners by 80% and reduce VOC emissions by 89%. Another exciting method that we've come across recently is ultrasonic parts washers. So some of we have at least a couple of EcoBiz certified businesses in the Portland area that are using these. We're trying to share this method with other shops in the area. You can also scan that QR code to read about the 2 shops that I'm referencing and the payback period. So ultrasonic parts washers use cavitation, so this is like the bubbles. So the scrubbing bubbles with an aqueous cleaner to remove grease from parts. These can run as low as $300 to $600 for a benchtop unit that's about 35 gallons. But you could also use a 100-liter unit for higher volume shops. So the 2 repair shops in the EcoBiz case study use just an all-purpose cleaner that is EPA Safer Choice certified. So you can see it right here. It's the simple green Safer Choice version. Other Green Seal, Eco Logo, or Safer Choice degreasers, those third-party certified degreasers, are expected to work equally well. And we have heard reports of about a 10-to-1 water to product dilution with water, being effective. So I'm going to show a short video clip of one of our shops cleaning apart with their ultrasonic unit. I hope it plays well. So here it is. So hopefully that came in clearly, but we were first turned on to this method by Audubon Motorworks in Beaverton. And they let us know that multiple customers have asked them if they replaced old parts for new ones, since the ultrasonic units are able to get parts so clean. And we're hearing more shops are using these since they're very safe, they're very effective. They save time because you can drop the part in and go about your work and come back. And they're also very cost effective. All right, back to you, Michelle.
Thank you. So I do not profess to be an expert in aqueous parts washing. Probably know enough to be dangerous, but we do know that it's a more expensive option, maybe not as economical for smaller shops versus like a larger shop or dealerships or fleets. They need to have low foaming detergents, and there are numerous advantages over, because you have lower toxicity than you would with the solvents. But I'll talk a little bit more about some of the issues with them. So things to watch for in your detergents, a pH above 11. I'm just kind of picking that number because that's the limit that EPA Safer Choice has in their products, a pH of 11 or less to get certified. So if you're at the point of use, if your pH is above 11, you really need to be very careful with handling and PPE and keeping it off your skin and away from your eyes, of course. Then another issue is a lot of the detergents will have phosphorus in them, and 17 states have banned phosphorus because in dish and laundry soaps, because if it gets to the wastewater treatment plant and in significant amounts and they can't remove enough of it, it really impacts the waterways. A lot of phosphorus in waterways will create algae blooms and starve fish of oxygen. So some potentially safer alternatives, or at least that have made the certified clean air list at the SCAQMD, can be found by looking at this or accessing this QR code to the right here. They also list some soy-based solvents and some chlorinated solvents, but those wouldn't be for aqueous cleaners, obviously. But it's kind of an interesting list to look at for if you're looking to reduce your VOC releases. Next slide. So disposable spent wash water from these ultrasonic and aqueous systems. So this, the enzymatic typically does not result in hazardous waste. You shouldn't ever have to dump it, just replenish the solution and the enzymes. But these other two, the fluids and the sludge from them may depend, it depends on what parts are cleaned and whether oil is skimmed and how effectively oil can be separated, and whether the contaminants are entering the system. So for instance, if you were using an aerosol, a chlorinated aerosol near your ultrasonic parts washer with the lid open, those airborne particles can enter the system and contaminate the oil, making it unusable to go back into your used oil collection, and it can contaminate the bath as well, making it probably highly likely to designate as hazardous. So companies, the fluid does pick up contaminants over time, as these four are listed here. So probably necessary to work with your state or local agency to make sure it designates as non-hazardous if you're going to send it down the sanitary. Otherwise, it is considered a hazardous waste. I think that's it from this slide. What's the next slide? Steam cleaning. So we know Autobahn is also using, in addition to introducing us to ultrasonic, they're using a steam cleaner to clean engines. And they reported pretty good success with it. And so I didn't know much about it, but a lot of detail, I went online and looked it up a little bit. And a lot of detailers will use these wands, these little small steam wands to clean engines. And it does require can be effective. You can even use a little bit of an aqueous degreaser in a spray form to can you still hear me? My computer says its internet is unstable. Okay. Anyway, but if you do choose to use this method, it's always ensure you have any drips from the process are captured underneath with the drain pan. And now we are on to aerosols. So some formulas will still include some lower amount of something like the toluene or xylene, which are carcinogens. I previously mentioned. This similar to what we want to avoid in the bulk solvents. So it's the chlorinated methanol, benzene compounds, xylene, toluene. And you can choose these lower VOC products as well. And I wanted to show you it's a little bit small, but you can see the label on the Subaru product is compliant with the 3% VOC level. So, and another thing is to consider refillables. And I think Brittany's gonna, oh wait, nope, Brittany's gonna talk about that in a minute, but I have one more slide to present to you. This is a pilot study some time ago, a little bit dated. And so some formulations may have changed since the project occurred. But Minnesota was seeking to reduce VOC releases in Minnesota, and they tested various blends of these aerosol brake cleaners containing sourced from their local Auto Value and Napa and O'Reilly stores. And once a shop found something they felt that worked, they were given a whole case of the product and asked to use it and provide feedback on the performance. So the ones in yellow were achieved satisfactory results in their cleaning efforts, but the important part here is to look at the VOC percent. So the lower volatility products, two of them, one at 7.5 and one at 9.2%, seem to perform well. And if you want to stay under the California threshold of 10%, those two might be good products to look at. The other ones are getting pretty high up there again in the VOC levels. And there's a QR code if you want to look at that research in that project. And that is back to Brittany at this point.
Right. So yeah, so if you can't, fully convert to aqueous and you still want to use aerosol cleaners in some situations, of course, the first effort should be to try to find a less toxic formula. And EcoBiz, we're happy to help you with this if interested. But other options that can reduce waste or exposure include converting to refillables, and there are several different models of refillables. You should also, ventilate the area while using aerosol products, so opening a garage door or having a good HVAC system or a fan that circulates air. Also using, recommended PPE. And you can also, spray solvents onto a rag instead of into the air or onto a surface. And there are these solvent plungers that can help with that as well. And then, as I think, Michelle, I think you already mentioned this, but we also want to avoid spraying aerosols above or around aqueous cleaning systems, since the chemicals can contaminate the wastewater in those systems. So if you're using aerosols, once you find a less toxic, safer formulation, it's good to work with your suppliers to provide formulation in bulk for refillables. So what's so bad with aerosol cans? Well, number one, ounce for ounce, spray-on products sold in aerosol cans cost roughly twice as much as bulk product. Number two, you are paying for the propellants in each individual aerosol can that you purchase. So most cans contain about 10 to 15% propellant by weight. And these contain, carbon dioxide, propane, butane. So these are commonly used aerosol propellants that can contribute to global warming. And then the last point is that used aerosol cans may be considered hazardous waste. As I mentioned, there are several different refillable dispenser options. Some automotive staff prefer one over the other. We've heard mixed feedback on various models. So if your staff don't like the one of the options that you've chosen, definitely encourage you to try different models, because they have different types of nozzles that spray differently and function differently. And last thing I'll mention is that EcoBiz has this cost savings worksheet that I'm happy to share with anyone that's considering switching from single-use aerosols to bulk, so that you can see how much money you can save and the payback period. So that was a lot of information. Are there any questions? Feel free to unmute or feel free to type into the chat any questions that you might have. Also, feel free to contact either me or Michelle. Our contact information is there at the bottom with any follow-up questions. So, and if there are no questions at this point, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here and, taking the time to think about safer alternatives to traditional solvents. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maya.